Russendale is traveling from England to Rutina to see the coronation of King Rudolph. A chance meeting in the woods brings Russendale and Rudolph face to face, and they discover that they look exactly alike. Even their hair is the same shade of brilliant red, the color of Rudolph's royal Ilfburg family. The next day, Rudolph is found unconscious and unable to attend his coronation. But the show must go on, or else the king, half brother, and enemy Black Michael, the Duke of Streslow, will take over the throne. For the sake of Rutinia, Rassendel must pretend to be Rudolph for the day and take part in coronation. The king's friends Colonel Sapt and Fritz von Tranhilm promise to help, but will Rassendal manage to deceive Black Michael and Princess Falvia, the woman who Rudolph is engaged to marry? Read on to find out. The game had begun. The cool morning air streaming in through the window of the train cleared my head, and I was able to take in all Sapt said to me. He was wonderful. He began at once to he began at once to instruct me in the history of my past life, of my family, of my taste, pursuits, weaknesses, friends, companions, and servants. He told me the etiquette of Rutenian court and promised to be constantly at my elbow to point out everybody whom I ought to know. At 9:30, looking out of the window, I saw the towers of the great city. Your capital, my liege, grinned old Sapt. With a wave of his hand leaning forward, he laid his finger on my pulse. A little too quick, he said in grumbling tone. I am not made of stone, I exclaimed. You will do, said he with a nod. Then he paused and looking at us, said quietly, God send we may be alive tonight. Amen, said Fritz. The train stopped. Fritz and Sap leaped out and held the door for me. I choked down a lump that rose in my throat. Then I settled my helmet firmly on my head and breathed a shortly prayer to God. The last thing I did was to feel my revolver was handy and my sword loose in scabbard. Then I stepped onto the platform of the station at Streslow. The bells throughout the city broke into a joyful peal. The sound of military band and of men cheering struck my ear. King Rudolph V was in his good city of Streslow, and they shouted outside, God save the king. Old sapped mouth wrinkled into a smile. God save them both, he whispered. Courage, lad. And I felt his hand pressed my arm. A group of officers stood awaiting me. Their head was a tall old man, covered with medals in military uniform. Marshal, whispered Sapt. I knew I was in the presence of the most famous veteran of Rotinian army. The marshal saluted me in few royal words. I accepted his greetings very suavely and received the compliments of large number of distinguished guests. No one revealed the least suspicion, so I felt my nerve returning and the troubled beating of my heart subsiding. Presently, I mounted my horse and started to ride through the streets with the marshal on my right and Sapt on my left. The scene was brilliant as we rode. slowly to where the royal place stood. Every house was hung with red and decorated with flags. The streets were lined with raised seats on each side. I passed along, bowing this way and that, under a shower of cheers, blessings, and waving handkerchiefs. The balconies were full of brightly dressed ladies who clapped their hands and curtsied. A torrent of red roses fell on me. One bloom lodged in my horse, and I took it and stuck it in my coat. The marshal smiled grimly. The red roses for the Elfbergs, Marshal. I gaily, and he nodded. I have written gaily in strange word, it must seem. But the truth is that I was giddy with excitement. At that moment, I almost believed that I was in very truth the king. Well, we went by, and then the marshal, returning round in his saddle, waved his hand. The soldier closed round us, so that the crowd could not come near me. We were leaving my quarter of city and entering Duke Michael. Here, Black Michael of Streslew was a hope, a hero, and a darling. This action of Marshall showed me more clearly than words what the state of feeling in the town must be. But if fate made me king, the least I could do was to play the part handsomely. Why this change in our order, Marshal? I said. It's more prudent, sir, he murmured. I stopped the horse. Let those in front ride on, said I, till they are 50 yards ahead. But you, Colonel Sut, and my friends, wait here till I have ridden 50 yards and see that no one is nearer to me. I will have my people see that their king trusts them. Sat laid his hand on my arm. I shook him off. The marshal hesitated. Am I not understood? Said I. And the marshal gave the orders. I saw old Sapt smiling into his beard, but he shook his head at me. If I had been killed in an open day in the streets of Streslew, Saft's position would be a difficult one. So I, riding alone, entered this barely decorated part of town. It was more interesting, for I heard the comments of the crowd. If he is red, he is right, cried an old woman. I laughed and took off my helmet so that she might see that I was one of right color, and crowd cheered me at that. He looked paler than usual, said one. He is bigger man than I thought, said another. So he had a good jaw under that beard after all, commented a third. The pictures of him aren't handsome enough, declared a pretty girl. But in spite of these signs of approval and interest, the mass of the people received me in silence with sullen looks. At last we were at the church, and for the first time the sudden sense of my audacity almost came over me. Everything was in a mist. As I dismounted, I saw the marshal and slept dimly the group of gorgeously robed priests who awaited me, and my eyes were still dim as I walked up aside. I saw nothing of the crowd that filled the church. Only two faces stood out side by side clearly before my eyes. The face of a girl, pale and lovely, and face of a man whose red cheeks, black hair, and deep eyes told me that I was in the presence of my brother, Black Michael. And when he saw me, his red cheeks went pale all in a moment. and his helmet fell with a clatter on the floor. Till that moment, he had not realized that the king had indeed come to Streslew. Of what followed next, I remembered nothing. I knelt before the priest and he anointed my head. Then I rose to my feet, took from him the crown of Rutenia and set it on my head. I swore the old oath of king. Then the lady with pale face stepped ahead from her place and came to where I stood. And an attendant cried, Her Royal Highness, the Prince Falvia. Falvia put her hand in mine and cursed it low, and then came to Duke of Streslew. His step trembled, I swear, and he looked to the right and to the left, as man looks who thinks on flight. His face was patched with red and white. His hand shook, and I felt his lips dry and parched as he kissed my hand. Resolutely doing my duty, I took my dear Michael by my both hands and kissed him on the cheek. I think we were both glad when that was over, but neither in face of the princess nor anyone else did I see the least doubt or questioning. But neither she nor anyone else dreamed or imagined that the king saw for an hour I stood there, as thought I had been a king all my life. Everybody kissed my hand, and the ambassadors paid me their respects. Then back we went through the streets to the palace. I was in a carriage now, side by side with Princess Falvia. She returned to me. Do you know, Rudolph? She said. You look somehow different today. The fact was not surprising, but the remark was disquieting. I said what was perfectly true. My dear princess, it must be because nothing in my life has affected me more than the reception I have been greeted with today. She smiled brightly, but in an instant grew grave and whispered, Did you notice Michael? Yes, said I, adding, He wasn't enjoying himself. Do be careful, she went on. You don't keep enough watch on him, you know. I know, said I, that he wants what I have got. Bang, blare, blare. We were at the palace. Guns were firing and the trumpets blowing. Rows of attendants stood waiting. I handed the princess up the broad marble staircase. Then I took formal position and crowned king of the royal palace and wondered what the king of Rutenia was doing. The excitement heats up as Black Michael kidnaps the real king, and Resendel is forced to keep up the pertinence for longer than he expected to. The story of how he rescues Rudolph and saves the throne of Rutenia from Michael forms the story of the prisoner of Zenda. Thank you so much.